Chapter 1. A Culture of Violence. His parents named him for the building in which he was born, but Church Lester's first name must have been bitter irony for those who suffered at his hands. Known as a good friend to many, but a dangerous enemy to some, Church killed several people during his 44 years of life. 3 little girls died during his most notorious crime, the bombing of a home in Carter County, Tennessee. Church and 3 other Bledsoe County men set the explosives during the dark morning hours of Friday, January the 7th, 1938. The intended victim, the girl's father, wasn't even home. Church was sentenced to death after a widely publicized trial, but hanged himself in his jail cell before he could face the electric chair. The intense lawlessness of the area in which Church grew up carried over from the Civil War era into the 20th century. This book mainly focuses on the period from 1900 to 1940, which includes the chaotic periods of World War I, the Roaring Twenties, and the Great Depression. The specific focus of this culture of violence is Bledsoe County. It's a small 400 square mile, poor and mostly rural county. It sits in the broad, picturesque valley of the Sequatchie and is bounded on the east by Walden's Ridge and on the west by the Cumberland Plateau. Bledsoe's only town, Pikeville, is the county seat, which is located 50 miles north of Chattanooga. Bledsoe County is one of the beauty spots of the southern Appalachian Mountains. Following the Civil War, Bledsoe County was dubbed Bloody Bledsoe. A 1938 True Detective magazine article stated, Bledsoe's homicide rate is larger per capita than any other section of Tennessee, and the rate of convictions was the lowest. This article added, feud deaths was not considered murders in the mountains. Charles Clark Jr. says, my dad grew up in a time when violence, moonshining, and death were the result of poverty, the depression, and the isolation in which they lived. People didn't dial 911 or go to a lawyer or sue someone. They took care of their problems themselves. Hoyt Swafford was raised in Bledsoe County and is now a retired lawyer living in Crossville. While he was attending a legal conference in the mid-1900s, a judge from the northern state asked him, why do the courts and the juries in Bledsoe County let so many people who have killed someone go free? Hoyt told the judge, we take into consideration whether or not that person who was killed needed to be killed. Hoyt's answer seems to sum up what appears to have been the rule of law in Bledsoe County. As a result, many killers were never prosecuted, or, if prosecuted, were found not guilty. It seemed logical that the general population was fully aware of the minimal chance of ever serving time for killing someone. This knowledge undoubtedly led to other killings. 5 years of extensive research has resulted in the discovery of 211 people killed in Bledsoe County by Bledsoe County men from 1861 through 1950. At least 95% or more of these killings took place inside the county. For these 211 killings, we have records of only 45, or 21% of the killers being sentenced to a prison term in Bledsoe County, and none were given the death penalty. Many additional killings by Bledsoe County men most likely occurred but were not discovered by this extensive research. This is especially true for earlier years for which sparse records exist. For example, no microfilm records are available for Bledsoe County newspapers published prior to 1927. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the TBI, was not established until 1951. The FBI was very small prior to 1950, and it was seldom involved in rural homicides. In the years prior to 1950, the sheriff represented 99% of the law enforcement. If the sheriff did not choose to prosecute, there was very little a citizen could do about it. Church Lester was quoted as saying, you can get by with killing a man easier than you can for stealing a hog. He was an authority on the subject. Church Lester had 7 notches on his gun when he died, indicating that he had killed 7 people, but he never served time in prison for killing anyone in Bledsoe County. Around 1904, Samps, Monroe Beach, hitched his favorite horse to his buggy and took his young son Dewey to Pikeville late one Saturday afternoon. Before Sampson went inside a bootleg joint, he told Dewey, son, You lay down in this buggy because there may be a shooting. They average killing a man here in Pikeville every week. If they don't kill someone one week, 2 will be killed the following week to make up for it. Sure enough, while his father was inside, Dewey heard shots being fired close by. When Sampson came out, they discovered someone had shot at another person, missed, and hit Sampson's horse in the jaw. Charles Holder, Sr., was a pioneer of Church of Christ ministry in Pikeville from 1903 to 1909. When he told a colleague he planned to go to Bledsoe County to preach, the person told him, "Those people are too rough and wicked. You don't need to go there." Lucille Lewis said Bledsoe County in the 1920s and 30s was the wild, wild west, but it was also a fun time. Mary Elizabeth Beach's parents moved from Spring City to the College Station community to Bledsoe County in summer of 1941. A few months later, Melvin Stanifer was killed at a beer tavern nearby. This caused her mother, Nell Robertson, to say, "I know they called this Bloody Bledsoe, and now I know why. I want to go back to Spring City." As other killings continued to fill the news in the 1940s, Nell grew more and more fearful of living in Bledsoe County. On March 22, 1947, a deadly fight occurred at the same beer tavern between Lee Station and College Station near their home. 2 men were killed and at least 7 were involved in that bloody fight. Mary said her mother cried for several days following that terrible row, kept her doors locked, and was afraid to go outside her home. Because of this and many other prior killings, she again begged her husband, who was working at Oak Ridge, to move her back to Ray County. Several reasons existed for the inordinate amount of killings in Bledsoe County. The first was the Civil War. The sentiments here for the North and the South were evenly divided. As the war dragged on, the atrocities begot atrocities, and acts of revenge begot acts of revenge throughout the local civilian population. Guerrillas and bushwhackers took over. The animosity between families and the killings that occurred during the war carried over for many years after the war ended. For an in-depth detail of how the war so adversely affected the local civilian population, see the Civil War chapter in the Swofford Tollett Feud book. A thriving moonshine industry was another big factor in the majority of these killings, especially from the 1920s to 1950s. Moonshine was the county's lifeblood and livelihood and the root of its identity. This was an era of moonshine, lawlessness, and corruption in Bledsoe County. When national prohibition mandated by the 18th Amendment took effect in January of 1920, White Lightning became king of the East Tennessee Hills. The rugged terrain of the mountains on each side of the Sequatchie Valley provided a natural camouflage for making moonshine. Most sheriffs were not aggressive in eliminating this illegal activity. In fact, several sheriffs and their deputies were in the moonshine business themselves, either before or after they served as peace officers, and sometimes even during their terms of office. The Great Depression from 1930 to 1942 took its economic and spiritual toll on Bledsoe County and the entire nation. The majority of citizens and voters did not see the need to raid the moonshiner or the bootlegger and deny him a way of making a living, especially during the Depression. The majority of the male voters drank the moonshine. Moonshiners and bootleggers were very active in all sheriff elections, and a sheriff could not be elected without their support. There were many turf wars among the moonshiners, resulting in several deadly fights. For example, a big moonshine war in 1920 involved Jim Hamilton and 8 other men. 6 were severely injured by gunshot wounds. A few days later, one of the moonshiners shot and killed another one of the men involved in this ongoing war. When Elizabeth Royal was a child, her father would not let her and her brothers and sisters go to the movies on Nickel Row in Pikeville because it was too wild and dangerous. Cumberland Avenue, just west of Main Street, was called Nickel Row, and it was famous for its several wild beer and bootleg joints in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Some of these businesses offered bedrooms in the back where women of the night could take their customers. There were numerous fights and killings on Nickel Row during this time period. After the movie theater moved to Main Street in the 40s, Elizabeth's father allowed them to go to the movies. The Frostbite community on Walden's Ridge, where Church Lester was raised, had a very bad reputation during the early and mid-1900s as being a wild and dangerous place. Edna Swafford Thurman, who was raised in the Luminary community just north of Frostbite, said Luminary was tame compared to Frostbite. Frostbite was so mean we weren't allowed to go there. Many Frostbite men were in the liquor business, and most of these men were fairly decent when sober, but when drinking they were mean and dangerous. Many killings either took place at Frostbite or involved men from that wild and rugged area on top of Walden's Ridge. Let's conclude this chapter with some good news. The Bloody Bledsoe era that was given birth to by the Civil War ended sometime around 1950. Since then, the per capita homicide rate has dropped to about average for the state and nation. We now live in peace with our neighbors. Hopefully, we can continue to live together in peace and not have to contend with this terrible hardship brought on by the Civil War that our ancestors had to endure.